days, even the research was so old that the research wasn't black and white. I was doing my PhD, and my thesis was called Estimating the Intermolecular Forces between Proteins Absorbed on a Solid Surface Using Scanning Angle Reflectometry and Monte Carlo Simulations, which makes as much sense to me today as it does to you. It was incredibly theoretical, it was incredibly fundamental, and there might have been, I don't know, there might be still some practical applications to it 20, 30, 40 years down the road. I just wasn't that patient. So I mustered sufficient courage and went to speak to my advisor, who was a recent PhD from Stanford, and told him, Bob, I'm sorry, I can't do a PhD. I'm just not interested. And he gave me some of the best career advice that I had heard until that point. Remember, I told you, all my decisions until then had sort of been informed by sort of some kind of social pressure or peer pressure, right? That was the right thing to do. And Bob said, Prasad, you don't do a PhD for someone else's sake. You do it if you are interested in it, right? He was completely nonchalant about the whole thing. Even though I was one of his first PhD students, he had to write all kinds of proposals to get funding for me. I'm sure it meant a lot for him, right? And that was one of the biggest lessons for me early on, that I should be leading the life that I want to, not the life that someone else thinks I should be leading, right? So I graduated with a master's. Everyone was fine with it. And I applied to business school in the US at that time. So the next decision I had to make was, I was trying to pawn off my research assistantship at Carnegie Mellon as work experience. The best business schools in the US saw through that and said, no, that just doesn't suffice, right? Come back to us once you have worked, once you have got some real work experience. There were a couple of universities, like the University of Texas at Austin, which was a top 25 MBA program, but not in the real top 5 or so, that accepted me. And so I had to make a decision. Did I want to go to one of those schools, or should I actually get some real work experience? Until then, as you've probably heard from many stories about people from my era, the prevailing notion was the N+1 syndrome, that you would always say, you'd say if you're in the US, I'm going to stay here for 1 more year and then I'll head back to India, right? And that was the same syndrome that I was experiencing too. And I thought, let me just get my MBA and then I'll head back to India because this is where family is. But there's something, so I think as you go through your careers, you will find out there are some things that mean a lot to you, right? And brands, for whatever reason, mean a lot to me. And there was just something appealing about, let me hold on for something better. I really don't want to go to UT Austin, right? And so that was a tough decision that I made, especially because I didn't have any other alternative, especially other than to come back to India. The US was coming out of a recession at that point. The jobs were scarce to find. And I finally, after months of cold calling, found a job at this environmental consulting firm. It was called International Technology Corporation. And for the next 3 years, I was there. And I did some of the most creative, innovative work of my career out there. We were helping the US Army destroy stockpiles of rocket fuel. There was one called the Green Dragon. It's a chemical that goes by the name of pentaborane. And when you burnt it, it emitted this green smoke, so it was called the Green Dragon. And the only complexity with this one was it was rocket fuel, so it was very explosive. It was lethal as nerve gas. It was illegal to transport it. And the Army, the US Army, just suddenly discovered that they had tons of stockpiles of the pentaborane hidden in one of their bunkers, and they wanted us to do something with it. So we designed this very complex system which involved all kinds of robotics to open the cylinders a mile away from where we would be in the control room. And then we designed this chemical reaction which I had figured out by poring over declassified defense documents from the 50s. And we reverse engineered the system based on what they used to do when they were creating this chemical in the lab, they would use this system to clean up spills. And so that's how we reverse engineered this. So I was doing work like that, which was really creative, which was really interesting, which kept me going. But the organization was incredibly poor. Remember I told you Google is an amazing workplace? Well, think of the exact opposite of that, and that was IT corporation. The company didn't make a single cent the 3 years that I was there. Management was really bad. There wasn't a culture of learning. It was just a really poor atmosphere. And needless to say, that company doesn't even exist today, right? What it did get me, though, was because I was working in the national interest of the United States, I was able to get my permanent residency because of my work there. And so then, with that work experience, I applied to business school again. And this time I was very clear. I went to a few schools that I really cared about. I visited their campuses, and I got into Wharton. So I was very thrilled with that. So I quit my job. I went to Wharton. And business school was all that I wanted it to be. Finally, I was at an age where I actually got to experience the education that was meaningful for me at that stage, right? It was very practical. I think the education that you get in undergrad is very foundational, which is exactly what you need at this stage of your careers, right? But as you spend more and more time in school, you want it to be really practical, something that you can apply right away. So at the end, in business school, I thought that I should carve a niche out for myself by focusing again on the areas that I knew best, which was things around the chemical industry. But I wanted it to be around the growth areas out there. So I looked at the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry. In fact, I designed my own major at Wharton, and I called it Financial and Strategic Analysis of the Pharmaceutical and Biotech Industry. That is the area that I wanted to focus on. And so when I graduated, I had offers from pharma companies like Eli Lilly and Amgen and so on. At the same time, with my experience in environmental consulting, I liked the consulting lifestyle. I liked the fact that you were solving problems regularly from one company to the other, and that there was some kind of a definitive closure, and you had new experiences and very rapid learning experience throughout. So I applied to consulting firms as well, and I got into McKinsey. So that made my choice again. It was one of those decisions that I had to do. And I already told you I loved brand names, so I decided that I liked the McKinsey brand better than the Eli Lilly brand. And that decided it for me. So I was in Washington, D.C. for the next 3 years. I did all kinds of work. In fact, came to India for 6 months. I had never worked in India until that point. So I came to India, and this was the height of the dot-com boom in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I called up these partners in India in our Bombay office and said, hey, I want to work on something dot-com related. And they said, yeah, come on down here. We have lots of great projects for you. So I came here, and I was shunted off to Madurai to teach farmers how to grow rice. So I spent the next 4 months of my life talking to individual farmers about how they should improve their yields of rice. It had absolutely nothing to do with .com, but it was probably the best professional experience that I've had. It is very real. We worked with 80 farmers out there. Our client wanted to introduce a consulting service for farmers, basically. And so the idea was that we would provide advice to farmers to help them improve their yields. So we adopted 80 farmers, and we said, you do your conventional practices for all of your holdings except for 1 acre, where we will use the practices that we think are scientifically best. And then at the end of the growing season, we'll see what the yields are. We doubled the yields for every farmer out there. It just made me feel good, right? Even though it felt like consulting firms, this seemed like a typical consulting project, which is you teach people what they already know. But that's what consulting firms have gotten good at. So I did that for a few years, and then I got married, which was the best decision of my life. and, and I decided that I wanted to spend more time with my wife than my clients. I didn't want to keep traveling. So came time for the next decision. If I could have had a successful career at McKinsey without traveling, I would have loved to do so, but that wasn't in the cards. But what I really liked about McKinsey was the culture of being a very performance-driven organization, right? That if you performed well, there was no limit to your growth. And if I have one sort of message to give you as you think about what kinds of workplaces would you flourish in, I would always say, make sure that you understand that it's a performance-oriented culture, right? That is one critical, fundamental thing that you want to ensure. Because all of you are bright, you're the cream of the crop, right? You will flourish in a performance-oriented culture. So make sure that it exists out there. So I joined this organization called Capital One, which is in the financial services sector. They don't have a big presence in India. They have an office in Bangalore, and they might be even recruiting on campus, I hear. But they're a big financial services institution. They started off in credit cards. And until this time, I haven't told you about how I got into HR. Well, it was only at Capital One that I got into the HR side. They were starting up this group called HR Analytics. And I was going to report to another ex-McKinsey person who was going to report to another ex-McKinsey person. I said, these are the kinds of people I want to work with, so I'm going to join this team. And that was as simple as that. Because going back to this example, the thing that I learned from this particular experience, the reason that it stood out for me professionally, was that I realized at this point that it wasn't content that mattered for me. That if you work with the right people, that something magical happens. You really enjoy your work. And so going forward, I just wanted to be surrounded by the people that I enjoyed working with. And the rest of it would follow. So I joined Capital One. I never thought that I would stay for a long time on the HR side. I really thought it was an oxymoron. How could people decisions be made using data? I mean, it just didn't seem to go together. But as I said, we did all kinds of complex analytics. What I also found was that senior management was much more interested in spending time with us because they cared about the organization. In this new knowledge economy, all of these organizations really depend on people to survive, right? A company like Google, we are an innovation company. Without the most innovative talent out there, there's no way that we can survive the next few years, right? So in these kinds of knowledge economies, the top management realizes that the only way to succeed is by having a lock on key talent. Not in a bad way, but in the sense of there's something that you want to nurture, that you want to capitalize, that you want to build, right? And so I found that I was having a lot of exposure to senior management. And I was actually learning something about the softer side of the house, which by that time I'd done some pretty interesting technical work. And so I didn't feel like the challenge was really about doing even more technical work. The area of deepest learning for me was all of the stuff, the soft stuff, that even in business school, I really didn't have a good grasp for, right? So that seemed like the biggest learning curve for me. And so I stayed on out there. And then a few years after that, a search firm called me and said, hey, Google is interested in building a similar capability as you guys have built at Capital One. Do you know anyone who would be interested in leading that? And I said, me. And then I went and talked to the Google folks, and here I am. It's, as I said, not something that I planned for,